Edinburgh, 1877. A lecture hall packed with medical students, most of them half asleep, most of them waiting for the hour to end. A thin man in a surgical coat walks to the front of the room. No notes, no introduction. He signals to the door, and an orderly brings in a man nobody in the room has ever seen before. The surgeon looks at him. He doesn't shake his hand, he doesn't ask his name, he doesn't say a word for what feels like a very long time. Then he speaks. "You are a left-handed cork cutter. You were recently discharged from the British Army. You have been drinking since at least Tuesday." Every detail was correct. The stranger had not spoken a single word. Here's the thing nobody tells you. The room didn't erupt, it went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when people witness something they don't have a category for. Some of them laughed, because laughing is what people do when they're uncomfortable and don't know what they just watched. One student in the back row didn't laugh. He wrote it down, every word, the observation, the conclusion, the 10 seconds of silence before it. He wrote it down the way you write something down when you know, bone deep, that you just watched something that is going to matter. His name was Arthur Conan Doyle. The thin man in the surgical coat was named Joseph Bell. And I need you to understand something before we go any further, because every other version of this story gets this part completely wrong. Joseph Bell was not a footnote. He was not a charming inspiration Conan Doyle tipped his hat to in an interview and then moved on from. The method, the cold precision, the way Holmes looks at a stranger and reads them like a page of open text, that was Bell, entirely Bell. Conan Doyle didn't invent that ability. He witnessed it in a real room in real time, and then he put it inside a fictional man and gave it a cape and a pipe and a mystery to solve every week. The fictional man became one of the most recognizable characters in the history of human storytelling. The real man died in 1911, and most people reading this have never heard his name. And that, right there, is not the injustice. The injustice is something quieter and much harder to look at directly. Joseph Bell could see everything. He could read guilt in a posture, history in a pair of hands, character in the wear pattern on a shoe. He consulted on criminal cases that baffled Scotland Yard. He was doing forensic criminal profiling decades before the word existed. He saw everything. And the question that has been sitting inside this story for over 100 years, the question nobody asks because it's too uncomfortable, is this: what does it cost a man to see that clearly? What did he go home to? What did he do with all of it? The grief, the losses, the cases he solved but couldn't prove? The answer he carried alone, because certainty and justice are not the same thing, and he knew the difference. Here's what I can tell you. His wife died young. His son died in a war, and the record shows that Joseph Bell, both times, simply kept working. The clinical eye does not take bereavement leave. That is not a compliment. That is the whole tragedy of the man. And nobody talks about it because it's easier to tell you about the lecture hall demonstration and leave you feeling impressed. I'm not interested in leaving you feeling impressed. I'm interested in the part that comes after, the part that's true. Let me tell you something most history channels won't bother with because it doesn't fit the clean origin story they're trying to sell you. Joseph Bell did not wake up one morning and discover he had a gift. He was built. Edinburgh, 1837. Bell is born into a family where medicine isn't a profession, it's closer to a religion. His grandfather, Benjamin Bell, was one of the most respected surgeons in Scottish history. His father was a surgeon. His uncles were surgeons. By the time Joseph Bell sat down at his first anatomy lecture, the language of the body was already in his bones before anyone formally taught it to him. That's the context. That's the soil. Here's the thing about soil, though. It doesn't determine what grows. It just determines what's possible. What made Bell different wasn't the family name. It was a single idea he picked up from his mentor, a surgeon named James Syme, who had a principle he apparently repeated so often that his students could recite it in their sleep. The body tells the truth before the patient opens their mouth. Most medical students heard that and understood it as a clinical instruction. Examine the body, note the symptoms, trust your eyes over the patient's self-reporting. Bell heard it and went somewhere else entirely. He didn't just apply it to illness, he applied it to everything. By the time Bell was in his 30s and standing at the front of his own lecture hall at the University of Edinburgh Medical School, he had spent years building what I can only describe as a complete architecture of observation. He wasn't reading people casually, he was reading them like a structural engineer reads a building, looking for the stress points, the load-bearing walls, the places where the surface has been forced to compensate for something underneath. The calluses on a man's hands don't lie. The tan line at the wrist tells you whether he works indoors or out. The posture tells you whether he stands at a bench or sits at a desk. The wear pattern on a shoe tells you which leg carries more weight, which tells you about old injuries, which tells you about history. The slight discoloration on the fingertip of the right index finger tells you about a habit. The way a man holds his shoulders when a stranger looks at him tells you whether he has anything to hide. Bell could read all of it, simultaneously, in under a minute. And he was right with a consistency that didn't feel like talent, it felt like something else. His students admired him, of course they did, but admiration isn't quite the right word for what that room felt like when Bell was performing. The accounts that survived describe something closer to unease, the feeling of being in the presence of a man who, if he turned that same attention on you, would know things about you that you hadn't decided to share. That is not a comfortable feeling, even when you're not the one being read. Now, 1877. A young man named Arthur Conan Doyle walks into Bell's class. I want to be precise about this because the version you've probably heard smooths out the edges. Conan Doyle was not a star student. He wasn't the obvious one, the prodigy in the front row with the perfect grades and the burning ambition. He was a 23-year-old from a complicated family, smart but not yet focused, looking for something to organize his intelligence around. He found it in that lecture hall. He watched Bell like, and I'm going to use this image because I think it's accurate, like you watch a fire when you can't figure out how it's burning. Not just impressed, arrested, unable to look away, trying to reverse engineer the mechanism. He took notes, not just on the medicine, on Bell, on the method, on the sequence of observations, the way Bell organized what he saw into a chain that ended at a conclusion nobody else had reached. He kept those notes after the class ended. He kept them for years. In 1887, 10 years sitting in that lecture hall, Arthur Conan Doyle published a story in a magazine called Beaton's Christmas Annual. The detective at the center of that story looks at a stranger who has walked through the door and reads everything about them, their profession, their history, their recent movements, before a word has been exchanged. He named the detective Sherlock Holmes. He gave him the observation, he gave him the deduction, he gave him the cold, almost surgical precision that made audiences feel the same unease Bell's students had felt, the feeling of being in the presence of a mind that doesn't miss anything. What Conan Doyle did not give Holmes, what the fiction quietly omitted, was the part that came after. The part that happened after the lecture was over and the demonstration was done and the students had filed out, and the room was empty. What the real man went home to. That's what we're getting to. Here's where the story stops being impressive and starts being something harder to sit with. Because everything I told you in Act 1, the demonstrations, the method, the lecture hall, the student who went on to create the most famous detective in literary history, every other channel stops there. They give you the highlight reel, they hand you the myth with a bow on it and send you home feeling inspired. I'm not going to do that. Because the highlight reel is a lie of omission, and lies of omission are the most dangerous kind because they feel true while they're happening. So let's talk about what Joseph Bell actually did with that mind of his when the lecture hall emptied. By the 1880s, Bell wasn't just teaching, he was being pulled into real criminal investigations. Edinburgh police first, then eventually, correspondence with Scotland Yard itself. This wasn't honorary, this wasn't a consultant who read the file and offered a vague opinion over lunch. Bell was applying the exact same method he used on patients to crime scenes, reading the physical evidence the way he read bodies, looking for the detail that didn't fit, the mark that told the truth before anyone thought to ask it a question. He was doing forensic criminal profiling in the 1880s. The FBI wouldn't formalize that discipline for another 100 years. Think about that for a moment, because it's not just impressive, it's something else. It means that Bell was operating in territory that had no map, no protocol, no framework that validated what he was seeing or told him what to do once he'd seen it. He was entirely alone in his own method, in a field that didn't yet have a name. And then came 1888, Jack the Ripper. I'm going to be careful here, because this case has attracted so much mythology and sensationalism that it's almost impossible to discuss without the noise drowning out the signal. So I'm going to stick to what is documented and leave the speculation alone. What is documented, the Home Office during the Ripper investigation reached out to Joseph Bell for analysis. Bell reviewed the evidence. He applied his method. I need you to stay with me for this part, because this is where most channels would wrap it up neatly and hand you a lesson with a bow on it. I'm not going to do that, because what happened to Joseph Bell at the end of his life is not a lesson. It's not a cautionary tale you can extract a 3-point framework from and apply to your morning routine. It is just a man at the end of a long life, standing somewhere the method cannot reach. And I think you need to see that clearly, without the bow. Bell's son Benjamin served in the Boer War. The Boer War in South Africa was one of those conflicts that history has largely filed under minor British imperial engagement, which is one of the more obscene acts of archival minimalism I can think of, given what it actually was. Tens of thousands of soldiers died. A significant number of them didn't die in combat. They died from disease, from the ordinary, undramatic brutality of a body breaking down in a hostile climate, far from home, with inadequate medical support. Benjamin Bell died that way, not heroically, not in battle, from illness contracted in the field. The kind of death that doesn't make it into the dispatches because there is nothing to report except that a man got sick and then got worse and then was gone. He died in 1911. Joseph Bell was 70 years old. Think about the arithmetic of that grief for a moment. He had already outlived his wife by nearly 40 years. He had carried that loss in silence since 1874, through thousands of lectures and demonstrations and criminal consultations, and the entire long arc of Sherlock Holmes becoming a global phenomenon, without anyone connecting it back to him publicly. He had been carrying it for so long it had probably become part of him. Not a wound anymore, just a weight he'd learned to walk with. And now, his son. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, and I want to be honest with you about why it unsettles me the way it does. Bell had spent 50 years building a method for seeing truth, a method precise enough that Scotland Yard consulted him on the most notorious murder in British history. A method so complete and so transferable that when a young medical student absorbed it and turned it into fiction, the fiction became immortal. The method worked. By any honest accounting, the method worked. And it had absolutely nothing to say to a father standing at a grave in 1911. No reading of the posture, no analysis of the hands, no chain of observation leading to a conclusion that makes the thing in front of you bearable. The clinical eye, which had never failed him in a lecture hall, which had seen through pretense and deception and the elaborate performances people construct to hide what they are. That eye had no protocol for this. There is no deduction that addresses the death of your child. There is no method for it. The gap between what Bell could do and what this moment required was total. And meanwhile, and this is the irony I can't get past, the one that keeps me up at night when I think about this story. Meanwhile, Sherlock Holmes was immortal. By 1911, Holmes had already survived his own death. Conan Doyle, exhausted and resentful of the character that had consumed his career, had thrown Holmes off the Reichenbach Falls in 1893 and killed him. The public response was, by the standards of the Victorian era, something close to mass hysteria. People wore black armbands in London. Conan Doyle received letters of outrage from readers who felt genuinely bereaved. He was essentially forced by the sheer weight of public demand to bring Holmes back from the dead. Holmes came back from the dead. The fictional version of Joseph Bell's mind was so beloved that the public refused to let it die. The real man, the actual human being whose 50 years of obsessive work and accumulated loss and private grief had made that fiction possible, was aging and unknown and watching his son's name get added to a war casualty list. The math doesn't work. It never works. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Bell died later that same year, 1911, 74 years old, in Muskogee. In Edinburgh, in the city where he had built everything, where the lecture hall still stood, where the students once gone quiet watching him read A Stranger in 10 seconds flat. The newspapers ran notices, brief ones, the kind of notice that signals a respected professional has passed without quite conveying that something irreplaceable has gone with him. And now, I want to ask you something, not rhetorically, actually ask you. Bell built a method for seeing truth. He applied it to bodies, to crimes, to faces, to places where people hide what they don't want found. He was almost never wrong. The record is clear on that. He was almost never wrong about anything he turned that method toward. But here is the question the record cannot answer, the one that has been sitting underneath this entire story since the lecture hall in 1777. Did he ever turn it on himself? Did Joseph Bell ever sit alone in Edinburgh, after Edith, after the Ripper, after Benjamin, in the long quiet of a life that had been spent seeing everything about everyone else, and apply the method inward? Did he ever observe the wear patterns of his own choices, the calluses of his own habits, the posture of a man who used precision and forward motion as a way of never having to stop? Did he see what it cost him? And if he saw, if the method worked even there, even in the hardest direction, did he think it was worth it? I don't know. The record doesn't say. The record only gives us the work, continuous, uninterrupted, impeccable. The demonstrations, the consultations, the students, decade after decade, walking out of that lecture hall with a method they didn't fully understand yet, but knew they needed. The record gives us the output. What it doesn't give us, what Bell apparently kept somewhere the record couldn't reach, is the answer to that question. Whether he knew, whether knowing he would have changed anything. Let me tell you what Joseph Bell was not. He was not Sherlock Holmes. He never rode in a hansom cab to a crime scene at midnight. He never played a violin at 3 in the morning while a case assembled itself in his head. He had no Watson, someone whose specific job was to witness him, to record him, to make sure the world understood what it was looking at. He had a lecture hall. He had a method. He had a city that respected him without quite understanding him. And he had a life that accumulated losses like all real lives do. Not dramatically, not with a villain responsible. Just the ordinary, terrible arithmetic of outliving the people you were supposed to grow old alongside. Bell's life stopped in 1911, quietly, in the city where he had built everything. Now, I've been sitting with this story for a long time, and I want to be careful here, because the version of this ending that would be easy to write, the version I'm refusing to write, is the one where I tell you that Bell's life was a tragedy, that brilliance is a curse, that the cost of seeing clearly is a life lived in emotional isolation, and isn't that sad? And here are 3 ways to avoid making the same mistake. That version is a lie dressed up as wisdom, and I'm allergic to it. The actual truth is harder and I think more useful. Seeing clearly is not the same as living fully. That's it. That's the whole thing. Not a curse, not a cautionary tale, just a distinction that Bell's life makes visible in a way that almost no other life does, because his gift for seeing was so extraordinary, so documented, so thoroughly immortalized in fiction, that the gap between what he could do outwardly and what the record suggests about his inner life is impossible to ignore once you've noticed it. He could read a stranger in 10 seconds flat. He could carry the probable identity of Jack the Ripper in private for decades without breaking. He could lose his wife and return to his schedule without his students noticing a change. He could see everything. And the most dangerous blind spot any of us can carry, the one that does the quietest and most sustained damage, is the one we develop towards ourselves. The place inside the architecture where the method doesn't reach, the place where the observation stops, where we have, without quite deciding to, made ourselves the one subject we don't examine too closely. Bell left one case open, the only one that mattered in the end, the one with no crime scene to read, no posture to analyze, no chain of deduction leading to a clean conclusion. The clinical eye, which had never failed him in a lecture hall, which had seen through pretense and deception and the elaborate performances people construct to hide what they are. That eye had no protocol for this. There is no deduction that addresses the death of your child. There is no method for it. The gap between what Bell could do and what this moment required was total. And meanwhile, and this is the irony I can't get past, the one that keeps me up at night when I think about